Hello, my name is Justin Keefe. My email is jkeef005@fiu.edu. This is for the senior project Summer 4911 class for undergrad. My group is EFTT. We're working on a trending trade algorithm. And the purpose of this video is to explain the trading signal I've been working on for Head and Shoulders. Now, this trading signal was based off of code written as an expert advisor by Dmitry Gizelik. He uses a lot of the standard MQL5 library and has written a lot of code in MQL5. He's a freelancer, and I believe he does work for MetaTraders from time to time, based off of the articles that he writes and wrote and what he says in the articles. This code is based off of code he created. It is not all my original code. I have just converted it into a trading signal that can be used by the wizard. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into this. So, as I said, this trading signal that he created, or the expert advisor he created, uses stuff from the standard library and modifies it. For example, this zigzag class, it's based off of this indicator, an indicator for zigzag that's present in the standard MQL5 library. Now, this is the one from MetaQuotes, the one that he builds upon. This zigzag indicator helps to determine highs and lows, or extremes, which are highs and lows, which are necessary for the head and shoulders algorithm because we're looking for a head and two shoulders. Let me show you the pattern so you can better see it. See, here, this is a head and shoulder. This is a left shoulder, a head, and a right shoulder. And then the neckline is this line right here. These three would be extremes right here, and these of high extremes, and these two would be low extremes. Here, this is the inverse head and shoulders pattern. We have 3 low extremes here and 2 high extremes here. That's what we're looking for in the head and shoulders pattern. We're looking for highs and lows. We're looking for 2 shoulders on each side and a head. That's what the head and shoulders is based off of. And essentially, the head and shoulders pattern helps if there's a normal head and shoulders, which is present here. It means that the indicator shows that the people are going to sell. So that's when you sell. You sell at this breakthrough line. If you have an inverse head and shoulders, it shows people are going to buy. And you would buy at this line here before the price goes too high. The head and shoulders algorithm is not an exact science, and it's a strong indicator, but it can be wrong, and it's very infrequent and can take months and months to develop. So, back to it, this zigzag class, essentially, it helps us to recognize those extremes, those highs and those lows. That's what it's for. But there's this class trends, which is also based off of an indicator. See right here, this trend indicator. It's based off of this trend indicator. And what this trend indicator helps us to do is it helps us to note to validate our extremes, to make sure they have the right amount of data so they work properly. Because for the zigzag indicator, if you give too long of a time, it could miss a pattern. But if you give too short of a time, your pattern could be broken up into little chunks, and the head and shoulders, as you can tell, is a longer pattern, so that can't happen. This trend class helps us to have the perfect size patterns, so we can detect real patterns and get real results. So, we have 4 functions that are very useful in this class. We have this isHigh function, which if it returns true, that means there's a high extrenum, and if it returns false, there is a low extrenum. It's very useful, and it's going to be very useful later on. We have this regular extrenum, which gives us the extrenum by position, and then we have this other extrenum, which gives us the extremes by time. Then we have one other function that's very useful in here, this calculate function. This calculate function is very long, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but essentially what it does is it defines our extremes so we know what they are and we can use them later, which is very useful in our algorithm because we're going to need to be able to check extremes. It does a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to get into it. It's very complicated, but it will be used later heavily. The next class we have is this pattern class. And this pattern class is not just for the head and shoulders. This pattern class is also can be used for double top and bottom, head and shoulders, and other pattern matching algorithms too. This is more of a general class. Well, the trading signal extends upon this with the head and shoulder pattern, but this is the base pattern class. And the base pattern class, now that we're in the base pattern class, our extremes have already been defined by the other two classes, by our trend and our zigzag indicators. Now we're in our pattern. Now we're looking for to check if our patterns are valid. That's the gist of what this class does. So, the head and shoulder extrenum is based off of 6 different extremes of highs and lows. Well, at least 6. You need at least 6 for a head and shoulders pattern. Now I'm going to go to the head and shoulders pattern, which builds upon this pattern class. See, it inherits from this pattern class and tailors it towards the head and shoulders pattern. So it has all the functions and functions and variables of the regular pattern class, but it makes it useful for us. So this search, most of our work is done in this search function and check signal function. These are the two useful, create is useful too because you need that. But this search is where search and check signal are where a lot of work does. What search does is it takes in 6 extremes of highs and lows. If it doesn't have that, it exits out. Then it checks if there's been any extremes by time since our start time. This would happen in real time when you're doing it right now. If there's none found, it returns. Right now, we don't have any extremes. We're going to process them. And in this for loop right here, we're going to iterate through all the extremes. And if none are valid, if it's not valid, we're going to move on to the next. We're going to check if the extremes work. And if we find any extremes that work, we're going to return true, and we're going to say here we found them. That's what the search does. Well, more specifically, it searches for enough extremes to start a head and shoulders pattern, too. Then we have this check signal. And check signal helps us determine, used to detect where our entry points should be. You know, it's not as useful in the wizard anymore, but it can help to tell us. It still can help to tell us whether we should buy or sell. You see, this original was an expert advisor, so it did the trading on its own. Now that it's in the wizard does the trading. The stop loss, the money management, they set this stuff. But it's still useful to tell us whether we should buy or sell. You know, it's not going to be used. All of it's not going to be used. That's why I'm going through optimizations right now, trying to cut off parts that aren't useful. And that's what I'm doing right now. Yeah, it's used to detect our entry point, also our take profit and stop loss. See this signal? If this signal returns returns true, but if this signal is, if this signal variable, all of them are passed in as pointers. So the function doesn't return them, but they're passed in as pointers. If this signal value returns a 1, that means, hey, we should buy. And if it returns a -1, it means, hey, we should sell. You know, we don't really have to worry about the stop loss and take profits. They're just used later to check if our trade is valid and if we should do it. That's why I kept them in. But yeah, see, the signal will be set to -1, and this means, hey, we should sell. There's a reverse head and shoulders. And if the signal is set to 1, if the signal is set to -1, that means there's a regular head and shoulders. And if the signal is set to 1, that means there's a reverse head and shoulders. That's the main gist you need to get from this exact function. Very, very useful for detecting patterns. I do want to mention that we have this header file that does initialize our extremes and does, include some variables that we will need throughout, including when our search starts, our pattern, our pattern array, our trade array, and our objects. We're not setting trades anymore because the wizard does that, but it's still there, and I didn't remove it. But that's all really about the header file that you need to know. And then we move on to our head and shoulders signal class. This is the most important part of everything. This brings it all together. This allows it to work with the wizard. It's essentially replacing the original expert advisor, but converting it into a trade signal instead of an expert advisor. So we have our patterns here. We have our pattern that no pattern is found. We'll return M pattern 0. If we have the pattern is not successful, we'll have pattern 1 will return. And if it's time to go short, sell, we'll return pattern 2. And if it's time to go long, we'll return pattern 3. We have our long, our short condition, our check pattern, which is the original check pattern. We have our check pattern for buy, our check pattern for sell, and then we have our value set. I didn't set the values extremely high for this exact expert advisor. The reason I did that is because the head and shoulders, it's a very strong indicator, but it can be a gamble. It's not 100%, accurate. It's really more of a gamble indicator. So I only set the values for if it's not true, we don't find a pattern, to 30 and 30, and 60 and 60 if there is a pattern. That was because I didn't want some issue to happen where, because my signal is takes so long to develop, I didn't want it canceling out everyone else's signals that probably happen in a shorter amount of time. Because for example, Chris's double top and bottom happens in less time than mine. So I set the values to 30, 30, and 60, 60 to not mess up the other values and stop trades that could work just because mine says no. So we have this initialize function that initializes the head and shoulder, sets up our object arrays, it sets up our zigzag arrays, it sets up our trend arrays, it sets up everything that we'll need later. We initialize our indicator here. We have our long condition, our short condition, and then we have this is the original check pattern. What the original check pattern would do is it would take your pattern in here. It would check your signal. If you would buy, it would go to case 1. It would set all your values for take profit, stop loss, and then it will return. And if you had before, this was the sell, or this was if you should sell, it would sell your take profit, stop losses. What this pattern also does in here is if the price hits the take profit level on either side, it'll stop it. So we don't have, so we don't make bad trades. I modified this also. I took it apart so there'd be one for buying and just one for selling because we only check short and long conditions. We don't check both at the same time. So then we have the long and short condition. I'll just go over one because they're both pretty similar, just one's buy and one's sell. So we check that the time frame is for the specific bar we're looking for. We check all our previously saved patterns. We search for new patterns in real time. If we don't have any previously saved patterns, we look for new patterns. If not enough time has come to form a new pattern, we return a result of the first, that's saying that the pattern is not successful because one has not formed yet, and then we return out of the function right there. Also the same up here, if the time frame is not enough, we also return out. Then we check for new patterns. If the pattern is not valid, or the pattern is invalid, we return again. And then we search for the potential patterns in loops. If the pattern is found, we exit out of this loop. If it's found, which here, we continue. If the check pattern returns false, that means we have a pattern, aka by right here, we return false. And then I set the result to that we found something. And then we add the pattern. And then if the pattern after, we delete the pattern. If it can't be created, we delete the pattern and it returns the result of, hey, we shouldn't open this trade. So the long condition is very similar. I'm running out of time here. I only have a couple minutes left, or I have like 20 seconds left. So to wrap it up, this trading signal works using the head and shoulders algorithm. I think it's a fair balance. I'm still tweaking it, so I don't have, I had stuff to show before, but then I tweaked it, so I'm still tweaking stuff, so I want everything to be done. But that's all for now. Thanks. My name's Justin. Have a great day.